Hello everybody, Music Theory 1. This is video 19. The topic today is harmonic progression. I am David Farrell. Good to be talking to you all again after a day off of video time. Today we're going to be talking about harmonic progression. What does that mean? We're going to talk about how chords in the music that we study, in traditional Western music, tend to move from one to the next. We've talked a lot about describing chords, talked about describing them in terms of their quality as triads or as seventh chords, and we've talked about them in their context of the key in which the music is, describing them using Roman numerals. And I'm going to use those descriptions today because, as we know, Roman numerals place our harmony in the context of a major or minor key. When we describe those chords in the context of the key, they have specific functions in the key. Each chord, the 1 chord, the 2 chord, the 3 chord, the 4 chord, and so on, has a specific job that it typically does in music. Today, we're going to talk about those jobs, and we're going to talk about how these chords tend to work together to make the music we hear. Let's take a look at the first chord, the most common chord we tend to see in tonal music. That most common chord is the tonic triad. Today we're just going to be looking at some bass lines, and we're going to be moving in the key of B flat major, but it's important to mention right here at the beginning that the functions of these chords are pretty much the same in the minor key. The chords will be working the same way, even though in the video I'm going to be using major as our example. The tonic triad is home base in music. The 1 chord is our most stable chord. It's the chord we're going to see most frequently. We're going to start lots of our music with it. We're going to end most of our music with it. We're going to find it along the way. We hear the tonic triad all along. Its job, its function, is to be a stable foundation for all the other chords. There's our tonic triad in B flat. Right now sounds very simple because we haven't added any other chords. From our 1 chord, we can go to any other chord. 1 is completely open in terms of how it can resolve. And so when we compose, a tonic triad is a great starting point because the music can literally go anywhere from there. Let's look at the next most common chord in tonal music. After the tonic triad, the most common chord we see in tonal music is the dominant triad, the dominant chord, the chord built on scale degree 5. And the dominant has a very, very clearly defined job. Its job is to go back home, to take us back to the tonic. If B flat is our tonic, 5 has a really strong desire to go back home. Even just those 2 chords, listen. We really don't want to stop right there. We want to go back home, and that's what the 5 chord, the dominant chord's job is to do, is to take us home. When we see a 5, the most typical resolution will be to go to 1. When we're composing with the 5 chord, when we're writing our own pieces, our 5 chords are most typically going to take us back to 1. Lots of music in lots of different styles is founded on this relationship of dominant to tonic. You can write a lot of music without even using any other chords. There exists lots of music that really sits very strongly on just 5 and 1. Okay, dominant and tonic, these are our most common chords. Let's keep going though and look at some of the other functions. The next chord I'm going to talk about is the 2 chord, the supertonic chord. And like 5 and 1, it has a pretty strong function. The 2 chord has what I'm going to call a predominant function. Its job is to take us to the dominant, to take us to 5. 2 likes to go to 5, which in turn likes to go to 1. Okay, it would be pretty unusual for 2 to skip over 5 and go directly to 1, but it would be very common for 2 to take us to 1. Here's our 1 chord, our home base. We might go to 2, 5, 1, right? And that's a chord progression we've probably heard. 2 to 5 to 1. 2 has a pretty strong predominant function. Again, it would be unusual for 2 to skip over 5 and go straight to 1, but for 2 to go to 5 is something that we're going to be hearing a lot in music. Before we move along to more numerals, I want to point out something that relates this progression we've started talking about, and that is the fact that the roots of our chords, right? The roots of our chords are moving by descending fifth. 5 going down to 1 is a descending fifth, F down to B flat, right? We can figure out that interval counting B flat, C, D, E, F, that's a fifth. And likewise from 2 to 5 is a descending fifth, F, G, A, B, C. That's a fifth going down. This sort of root movement is extremely common in tonal music. Root movement by descending fifth is something that composers and musicians have been using for a very long time in a wide range of musical styles. And so as we continue, we're going to see that we can flesh out a lot of our chords by continuing this trend of moving down 5 notes in the root of the chord. And as we move forward, I'm going to be shuffling around our pitches because otherwise our bass line is going to get quite awkward. Just because right now I've written it in descending fifths doesn't mean that if I move those around an octave, say if I took the C down an octave, it would change the way our chords work. And so with that in mind, let's look at our next chord. It's going to be a fifth above 2. And that is going to be our submediant chord, our 6th chord. We continue this root movement by descending fifth. The submediant tends to resolve to 2, to our predominant chord when we see it. One thing we can make a note of as we move further away from 1 through this circle of fifths, through all these different fifth motions, the chord functions tend to get a little bit weaker. And so our 1 chord, we know, has a nice strong home bass. 5 really wants to go to 1. 2 likes to go to 5, which likes to go to 1. But when we get to 6, this chord doesn't have necessarily a very strong desire to resolve. It has a weaker function. It likes to go to 2, which likes to go to 5, which likes to go to 1. And that's a common usage of it. But it's worth pointing out that as we get farther away from 1, the functions of these chords get a little bit weaker. The desire to do what they like to do gets a little bit weaker. We're going to see that even more with the next chord, which is the 3 chord, very far away in our circle of fifths from 1. We have to go through 5, through 2, through 6, all the way back to 3 to get there. And because of this, the 3 has a very weak function. It's a very ambiguous chord. If we start on 1 and go to 3, we can see that we can sort of hear there isn't a really strong need to go anywhere. And because of that, the 3 chord is the least frequently encountered of all our diatonic triads. We don't see 3 chords very often. It is not a common chord. Most pieces we analyze will have 0 3 chords in them. 0, 0, 0. When we do harmonic dictation in music theory lab, or when we practice keyboard, we're probably not going to play a lot of 3 chords because they just aren't used a lot in a lot of the music we listen to. That said, when they do show up, their most common resolution is to resolve just like these chords by descending fifth, from 3 to 6 to 2 to 5 to 1. That's our most common resolution. As we start to move back in the circle of fifths, we are now so far away from 1 that the chords actually are less typical to resolve by descending fifth and instead have a different resolution. A fifth up from the 3 chord is the 7 chord, the leading tone chord. And while sometimes the leading tone chord resolves down by fifth to 3, it has a much more common function, and that's actually to resolve to 1. We know that our leading tone chord, like our leading tone in melodies, likes to resolve to 1, and it's also true of the leading tone triad. It has the same function as the 5 chord. 5 likes to go to 1, and so does our 7 diminished chord. Okay? We don't hear this triad too often in root position, but when we do see the 7 diminished chord, the leading tone chord, it does the same job that 5 does. It likes to go to 1. It has the same function. It takes us back home. Our 2 chord likes to go to 5. But our 2 chord can also take us to 7. Right? Our predominant chords can take us to either dominant chord, either the 5 chord or the 7 chord, the leading tone chord, which shares a function with the 5 chord. Let's go back one more to our final chord. That's the 4 chord, the subdominant chord. And again, our 4 chord can resolve via the circle of fifths. We can go 4 to 7 to 3 to 6 to 2 to 5 to 1. But our 4 chord, again, being so far away from the circle of the tonic, has another function. It tends to do the same thing that 2 does, which is to have a predominant function. Our 4 chord likes to take us to 5 or to 7 and then back to 1. A really common progression is 1, going to 4, going to 5, going back to 1, right? We could also have 1, going to 4, going to 7, going to 1. A predominant, going to a dominant, going to a tonic, right? A really, really, really common formation. And so when we're composing, when we're using that 4 chord, its most typical resolution will take us to some sort of dominant. It's going to want to set us up to go back home. It can do the same job as the 2 chord. When we're working inside that predominant area, 4 tends to move to 2 a little bit more frequently than 2 goes to 4. When we're composing, we're going to want to keep that in mind. It's a little bit more common for 4 to move to 2, and then for 2 to finish us off by moving to 5. This goes through all our common resolutions. When we're writing, say for a composition project that might be due in a little while, or whenever we do any of our composing for class, we're going to want to try to stick to the chord progressions that we've talked to. We have tonic, which is at the head of the class, the most common chord. It can go wherever it wants. We have 5 and 7, both of which share the dominant function. They both want to take us to 1. We have 2 and 4, which have the predominant function. They want to take us to either 5 or 7, and within that area, 4 will most commonly go to 2 rather than the other way around. Our 6 chord is a little bit further away and has a weaker function, but it tends to resolve to a 2 or to a 4. It tends to set up our predominant area. And finally, 3, the sort of forgotten child of tonal music, very far away. Its most typical job will take us to 6, which will then get us back on that cycle back to 1. But as you can see, there's a little bit more that we want to do. There are 3 common exceptions to what I've talked about, and I want to go over them to wrap this up. 3 common resolutions that aren't covered so far, and we want to include them in our discussion of harmonic progression. Let's start with one of the most common ones, which is a different progression involving our 5 chord. Our 5 chord tends to go to 1. But one of the most common exceptions to that is what we call deceptive motion. That tricky 5 chord, every now and then, just to sort of get the listeners to our music, resolves in a way that we don't expect. And that resolution is most commonly to 6. We'll have a piece of music going along with 1 and 5, and 1 and 5. And just when you think you know what's going to happen, we get 6 who shows up there. We start on 1, we go to 5, and we expect it to go back to 1, but instead we get a 6, which will inevitably start our cycle back off, moving us back to 1. 5 to 6 is a very common progression. It sounds very, it's a very distinctive sound because it plays on our expectations but twists them and sends our chord a different way. And so this is one exception that we see typically in music. Another common exception is 4 moving straight to 1, what we sometimes call plagal motion. 4's most common function is predominant, moving us to a 5 or to a 7 chord to move around back to 1. But every now and then, we'll just move between 4 and 1. Okay? It doesn't have the same finality or strength that a 5-1 cadence does. And so the 4 to 1 is not as powerful a motion, but it does sort of let our music sort of sit around in a waiting pattern before we eventually get the 5 around. Sometimes we want to wait before we use the 5. And so this is a common way to sort of stretch out a long section of music before we get to 5. That's taking our 1 chord, moving to 4, back to 1, and then maybe to 5, and back to 1. And so 4 to 1, a common exception to this, again, doesn't have the same strength as 5 to 1, but something that we'll see pretty regularly and that we can use freely in our own composition. For the sake of completeness, I'll mention the last one, which is 3 to 4. We don't see this that often because 3 doesn't show up that often, but every now and then when it does, 1 to 3, we might move up by step to 4 and to 5, and then finishing on 1. 3 moving to 4, an exception that we see enough that I want to mention it to you all here as a possibility. And with that, I've given you a pretty good primer on the common ways our harmonies resolve in tonal music. Keep in mind that this is for a particular style of traditional tonal music. We see a lot in classical music, in hymns, things like that. Other styles of music that use triads and keys, like say popular music or jazz, often use some variants on this. Oftentimes they're a little bit more loose in the way these chords resolve. Classical music and other sorts of traditional Western music are going to be a little bit stricter, and we're going to try to be strict as we compose in class too. We're going to try to stick to these common functions before we try to get all crazy and do other things. But it's worth noting that other musics are going to take more liberties with chords than some of the music that we study. That's going to be it for today. In this video, we talked about harmonic progression. We talked about all the chords that we see in tonal music, all the triads. Even though we looked at a major key, the way the chords function will be very similar in a minor key. They're going to be working the same way. And this is going to form the backbone of a lot of the ways we compose music. When we listen to harmonies in ear training class, we're going to be thinking about these possibilities as the ways the chords resolve, and that's going to help us narrow down the options for trying to decipher what chords we hear in a chord progression. And as we study music, we're going to want to pay attention and say, oh, this is a really typical usage because 2 goes to 5 and then that goes to 1. Or we're going to be able to say, hey, this is a really weird piece because 5 goes to 4, and that's not a progression I expect to see. Hope you enjoyed watching this one. Hope you enjoyed listening to me play the piano. It was a lot of fun. Until next time, have a great time, and I'll see you guys in class. Thanks a lot for watching.